community. In the previous video, we looked at this example here with these 5 cones. They have identical timing, however, the spacing is different. In other words, they have the same keyframes starting on frame 0 and ending on frame 24, all arriving at their destination at the same time. However, they get there differently. So far, we've kept the examples very simple because we've only been dealing with one channel, just the translate X. In other words, their movement along this axis here, along the axis going in this direction. The thing to keep in mind, however, is that we still have all of these other channels as well, and we could animate them too. I'm going to hide these cones and we'll focus on just the red cone here. I'll get rid of the animation I currently have on it, and now I'm going to key frame 0, scrub to frame 48, and I'm going to rotate my cone negative 360 degrees. And I'll key that. So let's take a look at the animation that we have. I'll play the animation. It'll be a 2-second long animation. And what you'll notice is that it has its default slow out. It comes out spinning slowly, gets faster, 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 starts to slow down, and then come to a stop. And then the animation repeats again. If we were to take a look at this in the animation, in the graph editor, Windows Animation Editor's graph editor here, you'll notice that now my translate X that we were looking at earlier has no change in value. But if we look at the rotate Z, we get a change in value here. Remember from the previous video that this axis, the vertical axis here, represents value, in other words the rotation in this case of our cone, and then this axis along the horizontal represents time. So this curve is representing a value change over time. Now, just like in the other examples, we can change this animation curve so that its rotation is different. Let's say we don't want to have the slow in, slow out. Just like the previous example, I'll select my animation curve, and I will use this button here, the linear tangents button. And by pressing that, I get this linear movement over time. And if we play the animation, you'll see that now the cone rotates at a constant rate. And that's why when it repeats, it just looks like it's just continually rotating. Or if we use this example here of the stepped tangents, this is going to be an interesting one because we're not going to see anything happen. If I play it, it appears that nothing is happening, but that is because it's doing a full 360 right now. If I were to change this value, let's say to negative 180 instead, then you'll see what's happening, where it will very quickly pop to be rotated 180 degrees, but because the animation is repeating, it immediately pops back. I'm going to change that value back to negative 360. And we'll take a look at some of the other examples. So I'll select my curve again, and what I will do is I'm going to flatten out the tangents using this button here. This button is it's the flatten tangent button, and what it did is basically gave us back our default where we have our slow out and slow in. But what we'll do is we'll take a look at a couple of other examples similar to the ones in the previous video. So if I grab the tangent for this key here, I grab its tangent, middle mouse drag. What I can do is make the rotation of this cone happen very, very quickly in the beginning. In other words, no slow out, but then have a more extreme slow in at the end. And if we play it, you'll see that that's what we get. If we want to try the opposite, I'll flatten that tangent out at the beginning, and I'll select my last key, grab the tangent handle, middle mouse drag it, and this will create an extreme slow out at the beginning of my animation, and then it'll stop very abruptly. It'll speed up and then stop very abruptly at the end with no slow in at the end. And as you can see, that's exactly what we get. So the key takeaway from this is that you can animate any of these channels here, and the fundamentals still apply as far as how you deal with these animation curves. I'm gonna get rid of this animation here, and we'll take a look at one more example. So in our first example that we looked at in the previous video, we had the cone moving along the single axis. But what if I need it to move diagonally across this space here? So I'm going to set a key on frame 0, and I'm going to go to, I'll go to frame 24 again, and I'm going to move this cone not just 12 units on the translate X, but 12 units also in the translate Y. So it'll be moving diagonally from here to here. And I will set a key. So now when I play my animation, it moves diagonally, and you'll notice that it has a slow out and a slow in because that is the default behavior. But the important thing to notice here is that it is actually moving on 2 channels at one time. Notice that when I scrub the animation that these 2 values here will be changing. If I scrub the animation, you'll see that they're moving simultaneously. And in fact, if we look at the graph editor by going to Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor, and we select those 2 channels, the Translate X and the Translate Y, because our curves are identical, and they're right on top of one another right now. Here's the Translate X. It's indicated by a red curve here, red indicating the x-axis, and for the Translate Y, Y indicating the y-axis. You can see that these 2 curves look the same. Now, if I wanted my cone, as it moves along this diagonal path, to move in a linear fashion, in other words, no slow in, slow out, I would need to select both of the curves and make both of the animation curves linear. And now, when I play my animation, it'll move in a linear fashion, no slow in, slow out, at a constant speed. Let's take a look at if I change the 2 curves so that they're different from one another. I'll open up my graph editor, and I'll take the y-axis of the translate, and I will flatten those 2 keyframes there so that I have a slow out and a slow in on just the up and down or y-axis on this object. And you'll notice that it no longer travels in a straight line. In fact, a handy tool to illustrate this can be found here under Visualize. If I go to Visualize and select Create Editable Motion Trail, you'll see the path that it's taking. which is no longer straight. Now I'm going to come in here and select my y-axis, or sorry, my x-axis, and I will flatten those. Now we have the slow in, slow out on both x and y, and once again it's traveling in a straight path to arrive to its destination. So my reasons for showing you this is that it's important to understand how these animation curves are working. It's easier to illustrate them by focusing on just one channel at a time, whether it's the Translate X or the Translate Y. However, in your animations, you're going to find oftentimes that you're having to deal with all of these channels at once, and then it starts to get a little bit more complicated. Let's take a look at another example. So what if I don't want this cone to travel in a straight line to arrive here, but instead I want it to do a nice arc and then arrive over here? What I would need to do, or one way that I could accomplish this, is by setting another keyframe in between frame 0 and frame 24. I'm going to go to frame 12. And I want this to travel in a nice arc, so on frame 12 I'm going to take my cone and I'll move it, let's say, right about here. And I will set another key. And now, if I play my animation, I'll get this nice curving motion. This is what is called an editable motion trail, which you find here. And it's very unique in that if we were to open up the graph editor here and take a look at our two channels, you'll see that in fact it is editable. I can grab this point here and I can move it, and as I do, the animation curves adjust accordingly. Now, one thing I'd like you to take note of are these keys on frame 12, and I want you to notice the tangent on the X and on the Y. Notice that these tangents are not flat right now, unlike the tangent here and here. These ones are pointing more towards, they're trying to create a nice curve here rather than being flat. Let's see what happens if I were to select these two animation curves here, the Translate X and Y, and flatten them out. Once again, I'll use the Flatten Tangent button, and we'll play the animation. And you'll see that that created a pause, a slight pause in the middle of my animation here. So if you want it to be smooth, as it in this in-between key here, what you would need to do is select the key here in the graph editor, and then you can use this button right here, which will smooth the curve there. You'll see that it will smooth the curves, giving us that smoother motion there. In addition, we can also adjust those curves as we did in previous examples. So I could take this curve here, this animation curve, and I can adjust it as needed. We can fine-tune it to get the desired effect. Now, before wrapping this up, I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to come in here and animate the rotation on my cone. I think I'm going to point it down the spline here. So I'll go ahead and just slightly rotate it here on frame, let's say frame 1, or sorry, frame 0. go to frame 12, rotate it like this, and finally we'll have it arrive at its destination and be oriented like this. Rewind, and here is our animation. Now, if I don't want to see this editable motion trail any longer, it's very easy to get rid of. All I need to do is select it, motion trail handle, here in my outliner and delete it. The animation will still be on the cone, but I will no longer have the motion trail visible. I hope this video has been useful for you, and thanks for watching.